Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Grant Talks. I'm Natalia Martin, Project Manager in the ACS Student and Postdoctoral Scholars Office. I will be your host today for this broadcast, which is being co-produced by the Council on Undergraduate Research and the American Chemical Society. Today, we will be joined by Dr. Nancy Jensen, who leads the ACS Office of Research Grants and also serves as a program manager for the ACS Petroleum Research Fund. We are delighted to be joined by the ACS Petroleum Research Fund awardees, Amy Graves, Liz Glogowski, and Jason Gilmore, as well as Sarah Tasker. Dr. Lindsay Curry, who is the Executive Officer at the Council on Undergraduate Research, is also joining us today. We would love to get you involved in the discussions, and you can share your thoughts and questions in the question panel throughout the webinar. If you have questions for a specific panelist, we ask that you please indicate that when you ask your question. The recording for today's webinar will be made available once it has been edited. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Natalia. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Curry and I am the Executive Officer at the Council on Undergraduate Research. For those of you that are not familiar with CUR, our mission is to support and promote high quality mentored undergraduate research, scholarship, and creative inquiry. We do this through our memberships, programs, and services, all in support of undergraduate research, and that serves both mentors and students. We have a community of more than 13,000 individuals and 700 institutions. And if you'd like to find out more about us, you can email me at lcurry@cur.org or visit us at cur.org. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our partners at the team at ACS for making today possible. Chris Chabon, Dr. Jörg Schlatter, Dr. Natalia Martin, and Dr. Nancy Jensen. ACS has been a great partner to CUR and really believes in the power of undergraduate research, and we thank them for that. And I'd also like to thank today's panelists. Thank you for taking the time to share your experience, stories, and answering questions of the community. That's really the heart of what CUR believes in, is sharing will all take us farther. So thank you. But I don't want to stand virtually between you and these amazing panelists. So let me pass it.
So I would like to turn it on to Amy Graves for her presentation.
Thank you so much for permitting me to speak to you on the 65th anniversary of the ACS PRF. I'm Amy Graves. I teach at Swarthmore, and before I had all of these honorifics in front of my name, in 1998, when I got my very first funding from the PRF, I was an associate professor. I had been tenured only a couple of years ago. I'd been told that the case was not that strong and that my research really needed to step up a level. And so in the intervening years, I've done my best to do research, and I have the PRF in great measure to thank. So my next slide is going to be one where if you visit these slides afterward on an archive, you see a gloss of this talk. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go blip and go right by it. So nutshell summary, gone. Okay, so what about the benefits of research with undergraduates at a PUI? Well, for students, it builds community. Back before social distancing and COVID, we gathered around food. We had ice cream socials for the entire research cohort on campus. We had pizza on Fridays for our departmental students. People stood up and gave lightning talks, and they're actually going to do virtual lightning talks about a week from now, sponsored by the library. So students felt they were in a community of research scholars. Many studies have shown that retention of underrepresented students is facilitated by research. Someone who is an underrepresented minority or first generation becomes part of a research effort. They find a home in their lab, and they start to build an identity as a STEM person. Also, research gives students ability to shine beyond the typical classroom. Rather than being the student who has a strong transcript, they might be the student who has a great resume and is going to get a fantastic letter from their supervisor saying how extremely competent they were in the research lab. Research provides an opportunity for co-curricular learning. So if the ACS is like the APS, AAPT, AIP, all these physics organizations, we have been working very hard to spread the message that we can't keep teaching physics as we have for the last many decades. The 21st century careers demand new skill sets having to do with the management of data, computation, different kinds of soft interactive skills. And so these get learned in the lab. And finally, the lab work builds bridges with people in institutions beyond the PUI. Maybe your research student steps off campus to give a talk at a CUR meeting or at an ACS or APS meeting, or maybe they come with you to a university to talk with colleagues and see how that goes. Meet mentors, meet peers at other institutions. So all these good things happen for students, and for faculty, research adds depth to our teaching. It allows us to create the next generation of STEM researchers. It is completely necessary for promotion, for tenure, for any advancement at a PUI like Swarthmore. It fulfills the need to do research if that is a life goal of yours, and it seeds further work toward this life goal, grant getting and collegial web building. Finally, for your institution, if you do research, you bring prestige to your PUI. You allow them to recruit new students. Students come in and the tour guide will say, look, you can come into a lab and do research with your professor, not with another student, and you can wave at the professor once every month or so. No, you're standing right next to the professor pursuing original research. It also recruits faculty who'd like to make teaching and research twin parts of their lives. And lastly, sometimes overhead money accrues, although I have to say, for the Petroleum Research Fund, not so much overhead with the PRF grant. That's okay. I wouldn't be truthful if I didn't say that there were also frustrations for research with undergraduates at a PUI. Undergraduate students are wonderful, but they are ephemeral. They might work for only one summer. When they work, they're lacking in the academic maturity. They're lacking in academic maturity that you'd find in a postdoc or grad student in your field. They might not even have background in the basics. You might be teaching them linear algebra or basic computer skills or basic lab bench skills. They're inexperienced in these hard skills and also the soft skills. How do you find information? How do you talk to a colleague? How do you evaluate a graph that you just made before you share it with others? So our undergraduates, while they often make amazing contributions to isolated parts of the work, it is rare that they grasp the entire picture of why the project is important, and it's up to you, the principal investigator, to stitch together the parts of their contributions to make a whole. All right, so as faculty, we want to do research, but we are required to mode switch constantly between research, our teaching, and our service. We can't go to the meetings that are a sine qua non for our university colleagues. No, we have to strategically plan for 1 or 2 meetings that might interrupt our teaching, and then we have to catch up on our teaching when we come back. We have to struggle to keep up with reading the literature and preprints, and every important preprint I read is a chapter of a textbook that I might not be able to read to be better prepared to teach my lecture class. We are good colleagues, but let's face it, we are in competition with university and national lab folks who do research full-time. And for them, research might mean writing grants, but they have their head in the research game, and we have our heads turned every which way. Sometimes at our PUIs, we're isolated. Some of us are lucky enough to have enduring academic family ties, say with our PhD advisor, our postdoctoral advisor, who had a big group and keeps us in the group, excuse me, and keeps doing work with us and enlarging our web of contacts. But in my case, most of the years, I've been the grown-up in the group. I've had students, and I've not had this really strong family web of other researchers on which to rely. And finally, our work is rarely uninterrupted. Yeah, there's 2 months in the summer, but please see this item. Our wonderful undergraduate students really need to be taught. So our summer work with them is often teaching under a different guise. And we are often lucky enough to get sabbatical either every 4th year or every 7th year, and that might be the time that we should consider closest to being uninterrupted. So how does research funding help us? I would say it's through tough love. That is, there are these problems of coherence and continuity, but if we are funded by the PRF, say, the PUI might provide one stipend, but PRF provides additional ones. Our students will collaborate. They'll teach and support each other, so we don't have to do all the teaching. They'll help each other progress. And there will be more likelihood that one or more of these students will want to return for future research. Grant applications are helpful. In fact, they're absolutely required by Swarthmore administrators if we want to get our sabbatical leaves. Not necessarily that they are funded, but that we have produced these applications and submitted them. They are required in order to gain tenure and promotion, and they're motivational. That is, they require the faculty member to read the literature, to ask themselves what coherent case could be made for their research, to ask themselves what skills they have, or what skills they could acquire to answer their research questions. So it allows us, enforces us to be the best scientists we can be, to build our skill sets in order to do the job of research. If we're lucky enough to be funded on the first or second or third try to the agency, this creates the ability to purchase equipment and supplies. Please forgive me for not knowing a lot about that. I am a computational physicist, so I need a workstation and I need a connection to a supercomputer, and I'm good. Visibility, which attracts collaboration. So your Office of Publicity at your PUI might do some type of write-up on the college webpage, or your wonderful chair might send an email to those above and to your peers saying, congratulations, so-and-so has just received PRF funding for this project. And finally, if you're a person with a good moral compass, the fact that you are being paid a salary to do work is going to make you work very hard. And the fact that there's a grant timeline and a reporting timeline is going to enforce your motion toward your stated goals. So I'd like to say a little bit about the 2 times that I was funded by the PRF and the 2 types of research we were able to do. The first was about 12 years ago. We were funded to simulate small guests in porous solids, in particular models of zeolites, applied to positron annihilation spectroscopy. So here's something that both chemists and physicists can love. It's like a hydrogen atom, but instead of a proton, we've got a positron. So this thing readily annihilates, although in the ortho state, a state of orbital angular momentum 1, it annihilates rather more slowly into 3 gamma rays than it would in the para state. And it lives long enough that this positron can annihilate not with its electron, but rather with electrons that live in the solid into which this atom has been injected. So our technique, path integral Monte Carlo, models each of these single particles as a chain of beads, if you will, a brilliant idea of Richard Feynman's. And that produces something that you might think of as the wave packet for this 2-particle system. What we were able to do, thanks to PRF funding, is we were able to do these 2-particle PIMC calculations of positronium in porous solids. I'm kind of missing part of my screen, so forgive me. This method allows one to be at a finite temperature. We were able to look at the polarizability of the bulk solids. So here is a picture of a spherical pore. The dielectric constant of the solid is 1 here and is 15 here. And you can see how different the wave packet looks. That translates to a different lifetime. And this is all about the lifetime. That's what's measured, how long it takes for these annihilation products to emerge. And that teaches us about the geometry and the constituents in the solid. We were also able to look at different geometries of pore spaces into which the positrons were injected. So here we have a cylindrical pore. We were able to add model argon atoms and understand the lifetime. And for this grant, we have some metrics of success, a bunch of publications during the grant period, not a lot, I don't publish a lot, 3, then 3 after, And I was ashamed of this for a while, but I don't think I should be ashamed of this. I think I should say that one of the missions of PRF is to seed research, and it certainly did that. It permitted our lab to continue with this research for many years. We had students funded by PRF and other sources. We had 6 theses. We had 5 students get PhDs and 2 get master's degrees. I got a promotion to full professor a year after the extended period of the grant ended. I see I forget if I gave myself 15 minutes. Oh, 5 minutes remaining at 3:16. Thank you so much. I have 3 minutes left. So eventually, in about 2007, I had to pivot my research. And it was because the national lab with which I had a very close collaboration suddenly got out of the business of positron spectroscopy. So PRF enabled me to do a very important thing, to change my research goals substantially and turn to soft matter physics, and to be allowed to pursue a project called Fundamental Simulations of Jamming in Confined Geometries. So I don't have too much time. I will just gloss what's here. We looked at models of colloids, foams, micelles. These are basically soft disks or in 3-dimension spheres. And these are pinning obstacles. Okay, stop. So I'm telling myself I have about 2 minutes left. So if you want to, chemists can think of these little pins as being sites of nucleation for the jam structure. People who do materials can think of these as being structural elements that stabilize a rigid solid. We were able to simulate this, calculate stuff like the Fourier transform of the pair correlation function. What do we call this? The scattering function, S of K, and see that spikes emerge. So it's not like a liquid. These pins were actually able to enforce a kind of solid structure. The figures here are figures from work that's in progress about the dynamics of the flow of soft matter. We have metrics of success here, and what I'd like to do in the interest of the fact that I've got about a minute left is to move on to a last wonderful thing that happened, which is that we were able to write a grant to the National Science Foundation. And so here are my students in 2018. This is Brian, this is Tristan. They're talking to students who are going to be first years at Swarthmore who are doing a summer experience learning about college culture. And here they're learning about lab culture in our computational lab. So based on Brian and Tristan and other students' work, we wrote this grant. It's for undergraduate institutions. It's collaborative between 2 PUIs. It's about jammed matter. And amazingly, it was funded on the first batch. So I have to say that having PRF funding really trained me well. And so we were funded for this grant. And here we are in this summer of social distancing. In this picture, you can count 4 faculty members, 6 students from 2 institutions. One thing I want to say about it is that this is Professor Casey Bester. She's an experimentalist, but she and her 2 students are unable to go into their real research lab this summer. So she's doing many wonderful things with them to prepare for actual hands-on research in soft matter. But one wonderful thing she's also doing is they are using data that we took in the previous summer, simulated data, to create wonderful visualizations. Here are our soft particles, large and small. They visualize the bonds between them. We'll be able to do more quantitative analysis of this system. And so they're analyzing the numerical data while they wait to be allowed to go and do real experiments. One more slide on how we work. It's crazy. I'd love to talk to people about what it's like to do remote research. Our students collaborate on coding using Google Collaboratory to write Python codes. We jump on a regular old terminal window and we shush into the National Science Foundation supercomputer to get our big work done. And here's my conclusion. PRF research funding has helped us enormously. It's kept the PI and her students engaged. It's advanced our careers. It's permitted us to take the next step. For us, it's been the bi-institutional NSF grant. It is not easy to get PRF funding. It requires quite a bit of thought about state-of-the-art stuff that we can do at a PUI. You have to be clearly persuasive in writing the narrative. Then you have to assemble outcomes data. There's a lot of putting together of data and required elements, much back and forth with the PUI ACS officers. However, last slide, applying for PRF research funding as a PUI faculty member has been very worthwhile in my career. And thank you, PRF, and happy anniversary. Done. Should I mute? Should I turn off my camera?
All right, here we go. So thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thank you, Amy, for getting us off to a great start. My name is Liz Kolgowski, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. It's one of the comprehensive campuses within the Wisconsin system, and we're a primarily undergraduate institution within the sciences. I'm actually an associate professor in material science and engineering here at UWEC, which is pretty unique for an undergraduate institution. And so when I was applying to faculty positions at PUIs, I really looked at my background. I did my bachelor's in chemistry, my PhD in polymer science and engineering at UMass Amherst, and then a postdoc that was actually joint between chemistry and material science and engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And so while most of the universities I applied to chemistry departments, I found this opportunity, which was, as I said, pretty unique for an undergraduate institution, and really thought about structuring my research program to be able to utilize the resources available at whatever institution I would end up at the time. Okay. So my research is focused on stimuli responsive polymer synthesis and characterization. So before starting my faculty career 9 years ago now, I really thought about what interests me as a scientist and what would interest funding agencies, what would interest publishers, and what would interest my potential research students as well. And so I thought about how can I contribute to science and material science and polymer science specifically, but also the future of science, training undergraduate researchers to go on to the next step. And so in my group, we focus on polymer synthesis. Specifically, we're using Arga ATRP to synthesize block copolymers, either diblocks or triblock copolymers or different architectures we're looking at now, and looking at their self-assembly as a function of changes in temperature or pH. And so we're specifically looking at polydimema or dimethylaminoethyl methacrylate, which is a dually stimuli responsive polymer. And as we change the structure, how do we change the stimuli responsive properties? And so we originally look at changing the structure to look at solubility in water and how it changes as we switch from diblock to triblock, or different molecular weights and molecular weight ratios. And what's really interesting about this copolymer is that it's soluble at lower temperature, and it switches properties. You expect the solubility to gradually increase as you increase the temperature, but what happens is our polymer switches and actually dramatically decreases solubility as you increase temperature. And this is known as the cloud point, so it goes from clear to cloudy, and it's a reversible process, and we can tune when the cloud point occurs based on pH, polymer composition, the molecular weight, polymer concentration, and ionic strength. And so when thinking about projects, I thought about how can I engage my students, everyone from brand new first year undergraduate students who probably haven't taken organic chemistry yet, all the way to senior capstone projects. And so I can design the project and the level of involvement based on the student preparation and their interest and how long they stay in the group. And so I can match what they're interested in based on the project. And then another thing I really thought about was undergraduate students are great because they're always excited about the project that's new to them, but they ultimately graduate, right? And so the most I can have a student in my group is for 4 years. And so really thinking about how to pass on knowledge from one student to the next was something I designed carefully up front, and develop standard operating procedures to share between students, make sure I'm overseeing everything that they're doing because I'm the one constant in our research program, and then having an internal website to share information from one student to another. And what's been interesting is that along the way, from where I started as a probationary faculty, tenure track faculty from day one until now, 9 years later, I've really had a chance to evolve and grow my research program. And so one thing I noticed was that if I was just passive and waited for students to reach out to me, I would get a lot of male students who would come and volunteer. And it was really important to me to be able to recruit more female students into STEM and more students from underrepresented groups. And so over time, I thought about what patterns was I observing, right? Why weren't female students potentially joining my research group? And I realized it's because they didn't think they would fit in and they hadn't been asked. And so I started reaching out to more students, and I started designing my projects so that during the academic year, even if I don't have external funding, I can recruit students to my group, and they can work in small teams together for credit towards their major, and they can get at least a taste of undergraduate research, even if it's only a couple hours a week. And they can get that experience, and then they can leverage that experience either into full-time summer research positions or REUs, or potentially internships down the road. And so as I thought about the actual projects my students were working on in the lab, we evolved the project from using standard ATRP for our synthesis, which requires liquid nitrogen and freeze pump thaw cycles. And if a student's only working a few hours in the lab a week, to have a synthesis take 3 hours to set up was really holding back how much they could get done. And so by switching from standard ATRP to Argot ATRP, we could set up the reaction faster because liquid nitrogen and freeze pump thaw isn't needed anymore. And it's safer, right? Because they're not working with liquid nitrogen directly, just bubbling through solvents. And then the environmental benefits, such as less copper catalyst needed, just using ascorbic acid as the reducing agent, and ultimately the students can successfully complete reactions more quickly, and so they get to the results and they can see the results and they are more excited and stay engaged with their research. And then we can take those polymers that we generate. So even though the students are working in teams, each student has their own target molecular weight, and then so they have ownership of over their aspect of the project, but then we can compile all of the results together, like in this transmittance versus temperature graph. So this is the effort of many students working together with their different copolymer compositions, and then looking at the data to be able to publish these results. And so once I was hired into my position here in material science, we have a wide array of instrumentation that's maybe not typical for an undergraduate institution. So my research has also evolved to be able to take advantage of those projects. So starting from a more classic polymer chemistry research project to adding the different characterization we can do. So add in, this graph is taken using standard UV-vis spectroscopy, but we also have dynamic light scattering to get size data, rheology, interfacial tension. And so we can explore what's possible using the resources we have at my university, which is really important to design into the projects up front, because can't guarantee that you always have access to external instrumentation, and sometimes collaborators get busy with their own projects. And so being able to do our projects here was something I really thought about when I was setting up my projects. And so ultimately thinking about how this has led to success in my external funding. So ultimately I used my startup funding to get the lab set up and get some preliminary results. That was really important in showing that undergrads at UW-Eau Claire can do the experiments I was planning. And then using those preliminary results to apply for funding, including a new investigator PRF grant at the beginning of my career. And it was not successful the first time, and it was not successful the second time, but it was successful the third time. And that's because every time it was unsuccessful, I took that as an opportunity. I took it as an opportunity to improve, to talk to my peers, both at my home institution, but also peers within the polymer community, and talk to the program manager and see what could I improve, what was missing, and how could I make it better the next time. And then ultimately it was successful. So then it was important to use the funding to support students and my salary over the summer to collect more results and get more data and really disseminate that data that we collected. So both through publications, but also thinking about the standard national conferences, right, like ACS, but there are also other conference opportunities, especially for students like NCUR every year that my students have really appreciated participating in. And so those are all ways to disseminate our successes in the lab. And then using that success to apply for new funding. So using the results that we obtained from PRF and to get an NSF RUI, as Amy mentioned, that's provided more funding to continue our research. But there's other opportunities such as NSF MRI, that's a major research instrumentation, and other broader programs like REU and others that instead of just like the typical single investigator RUI funding, there's other opportunities once you get the basics down. And so ultimately, I just want to wrap up here and thank the students that I've had work with me. These are from the past couple of summers. Actually counted, I've had 54 undergraduate researchers over the past 9 years because of how I remodeled my program. Instead of 1 or 2 students a year, sometimes I can have 10 or 15 per year, and just giving more students more opportunities. And of course, all of the funding that I've had throughout the years supporting my students and myself has been significant in order to keep our research going and keep us engaged in the polymer science community. And yeah, it's just been a great opportunity to be able to work with these students who are always enthusiastic and coming up with new and creative ideas and bringing energy into the lab, and seem to really appreciate the opportunities available. And even in these times when we have to work in the lab socially distanced, we're still making it work and having fun along the way. So yes, thank you for your time, and that will be the end of my time.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Gilmore, and I'm at Hope College. And if there's any Canadians on the webinar, I apologize. I recognize that the Arctic Ocean doesn't extend this far south just yet. But it does put Holland, Michigan in the context of maybe some Midwestern cities that you have heard of. And today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work with long wavelength azo dyes and how we've gone from a very applied project back to a more fundamental one that was able to get PRF support. I will start though a little bit more about me, right? This is a fun opportunity because we're talking about my two favorite membership organizations and the ones I've been a part of for the longest. I did my undergrad at Virginia Tech, did a BS/MS there, and my PhD at University of Rochester before a short postdoc at Vanderbilt. And I came to Hope College in 2004. Hope is a really research-intensive, completely undergraduate liberal arts college. We've been doing significant undergraduate research and gotten external grants and published in peer-reviewed papers since at least the 1940s in chemistry. I was tenured and promoted in 2010 and again in 2016. I've reviewed for PRF for a long time and mostly for the physical organic panel, but my new PRF grant is actually, and my only PRF grant is actually with panel one, the synthetic organic one. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that came to be later. Because I am really a mechanistic organic chemist. I have a colleague that says all chemists are either makers or measurers. We are absolutely measurers at heart, but we've never been able to buy anything that we wanted to make. And we make these things so that we can study their photochemistry, electrochemistry, or both. We've a longstanding interest in a variety of photoresponsive materials. We do computational modeling as complete amateur hacks when we need to on the side. And my other interests involve peer-led team learning, course-based undergraduate research experiences to be able to broaden participation in research and involve students in my courses and my research program. That's, I think, good for them and for me. And then also mentoring new and future PUI faculty. To date, I've been funded by all these agencies. The Dreyfus Foundation gave me both my very first award before I even got to campus in a program that's been discontinued, and also my most recent grant before the PRF grant with the Teacher Scholar Award, but also Cottrell College Science Awards, and then being named a Cottrell Scholar after the fact, career funding from NSF, and also being a co-PI on a bunch of different MRIs related to instrumentation. And then a first little tiny seed grant from the Michigan Space Grant Consortium, which is how NASA parses money out to the various states, in my case, Michigan. All of those, except for that MSGC grant, were in support of work on this obscure family of Russian photochromes and how we attempted to apply them to be photoswitchable photooxidants to add an additional level of gating to a photoinduced charge transfer. And then by necessity, developing computational methods to predict reduction potentials to augment that work. It's only the MSGC seed grant of $5,000 from the agency and $5,000 from my institution that let me get into this project that my colleague Matt Smith, who is nominally a mechanical engineer at Hope College, but really a materials scientist, got me involved in, first as a small side project and now as the major thrust in the group. So azo dyes are a class of trans and cis isomers that organic chemists know lots about for a very long time. And there's a very big shape change that happens when you isomerize them, but that shape change in fluid solution generally is of no consequence. However, when you incorporate them in a polymer backbone, whether as cross-linkers or pendants or along the main chain of the polymer, you can couple that molecular motion into the microscopic environment where a trans to cis isomerization is cartooned here as pulling on the rest of the polymer chain. Now, if those dyes are either ordered in the material, or even if they're amorphous, but you only select which dyes you hit by using polarized light, then you can couple that microscopic motion into macroscopic motion and get materials that contract or expand or bend and unbend in response to light. This is a slide from Matt's postdoc group doing exactly that with a conventional azo dye. And these have applications as wireless actuators. They can be switches or valves or micromotors or micropositioners. All things that we can do with servo motors and solenoids and electronic signals. And frankly, we can do them better with those things, an engineer would tell you. But those things are all heavy and plastic is light. And so hence interest from, in Matt's case, the Air Force Research Lab, in my case, NASA, to doing a little bit of investigating in this. Not necessarily with the azo dyes that I show here, but with the ones from my title slide. We wanted to go to longer wavelengths. Conventional azo dyes absorb in the UV through maybe the blue-green edge. The problem is, so do almost all other organic molecules. And so that leads to problems of competitive absorption. If you've got little kids like I do that are prone to leave plastic toys in the summer sunlight for extended periods of time, like weeks and months, and you come back and they're faded and brittle, that's photodegradation. And that also is thanks to these shorter wavelengths of light. And finally, these shorter wavelengths of light are biologically incompatible, right? The UV will give you skin cancer, and the other wavelengths aren't transmitted until you get up to red or near IR, which is why when your little kids stick a flashlight in their mouth, you only see the red light coming back out. So the community was really excited when Yvonne Abrahamian at Dartmouth published in the early 2010s on these BF2 coordinated azo dyes. So there's your nitrogen-nitrogen double bond that can isomerize. Because they absorb from the orange all the way out into the near IR, depending on how you tune them, which Abrahamian did with this R group off the phenyl ring. So Matt came to me very excited about these dyes and the possibility of incorporating them into photomechanical materials. Abrahamian, like I said, had tuned a lot of these dyes, right? The wavelength changes are pretty significant between trans and cis, but as you vary this R2 group, now I have it labeled as off the phenyl ring, Abrahamian could see really big changes in the wavelengths of absorbance. And then you can see our dyes in orange down in the bottom half of the slide really don't have these great shifts that Abrahamian did, but that wasn't what we were trying for, right? We were content to be where he was in his parent dye, and we're just adding synthetic handles. And so folks that are polymer or organic chemistry inclined might be able to tell the kinds of polymers we were interested in from here. But what I want to point out on this slide is that we did see that putting things out, and we were the first ones to ever do this, to put things out on the quinoline ring, thus far only at the 6th position of the quinoline ring. Putting things at the quinoline ring has similar effects to putting them on the phenyl ring. And so we can compare HBr here at 537 versus HH at 530. It's only a 7 nanometer difference. But then when we go on and put a bromine also at R1, we get another 10 nanometers difference in the same direction. Or you can compare H-methoxy at 594 to bromomethoxy at 607, and there we get a 13 nanometer shift. So what we had just proved in our attempts at making polymer substrates was that we could tune the dyes just as well with the quinoline moiety, and maybe more, than we can with the phenyl moiety. And at this time, Abrahamian had returned to hydrozones. He's not an azo dye chemist. He's a hydrazone chemist that discovered these by accident. And really, the field has been left hungry to know more about these dyes than Abrahamian was willing to provide. And so we thought we saw an opportunity there, besides just the photomechanical materials. So we're still interested in photomechanical materials, but we've kind of been slow going. The Smith group is kind of working on things like Sanogo-Shear couplings, thiol-ine or alkynazid click chemistry. Or with click chemistry, we can put on diacids, phthalates and the like, and be able to go after polyesters or nylons. So once the Smith group has a system down, we can work to incorporate our dyes, but it has been really slow going. In the meantime, we've realized what I said, that these dyes are tolerant to substitution of the quinoline and sensitive to effects there. So we propose to vastly expand the scope and structural diversity of the dyes. Fortunately for us, the synthetic organic PRF panel agreed to fund us. In preliminary conversations, the more physical organic panel was less interested. They didn't see us as being maybe sufficiently petroleum relevant. Our main claim to petroleum relevance is value added to quinaldine as a starting material, which is a very cheap constituent of coal tar, and making these value added dyes from there. That wasn't quite sufficient for panel 4, it was for panel 1. And also that we were sufficiently fundamental. And so we are keeping it more synthetic and less mechanistic in what we're going to do. So that leads me to my first real piece of advice on getting PRF funding, and that is to talk to the program managers. They are really, really remarkably kind and helpful individuals. They're willing to spend significant time with you, and they can help you realize that the different panels may be worth exploring. And so these are hot links if we get this posted later, but you can just Google those terms and you'll find them too. Petroleum relevance and fundamental inherently mean different things to different people. So you have to make your own case, but you also need to check with the program officers to see if you're on the right track or not. You want to convey that petroleum relevance and the fact that it's fundamental science throughout the application, but you don't want to do it at the expense of making it appear esoteric. And so here's me putting on my reviewer hat a minute and say, you need to convince the reviewers why we care. Yes, it's fundamental, but why does it matter that we do this? The new investigator and undergraduate research grants for PUIs aren't as stringent as the ones to doctoral granting institutions in this regard, but there does still need to be something of a new direction to all PRF grants. It can't be an immediate obvious extension of your prior work, whether that's earlier into your independent career or as a PhD or postdoctoral student. You should look at the review criteria. Reviewers get sent them very explicitly, but they're available right on PRF's website. And so you should look through and see how your proposal ticks off the different review criteria. So I'll tell you in the time I've got a little bit more about where we're going and what do I mean by diversity, a diverse library of dyes. The first obvious thing we can see is, well, electron donating groups were good on the phenyl ring for abrahamian, so let's put them on the quinoline ring. So far, we've only done this at the 6th position, but we'll also do it at the 4, 5, and 7 positions. We'll avoid position 3 or position 8 for potential steric reasons or neighboring group participation. But still, that gives us 4 positions, a whole bunch of potential electron donating groups. You know, like you do the math and say, okay, there's 192 compounds we'll make. I'm like, my undergrads are amazing, but they're not that amazing. So we've started in on some of these already, and we actually start in-person summer research a week from yesterday. So I'm looking forward to getting into the lab for just 5 weeks with my undergrads this summer. But it's not just electron donors that are worth looking at. Electron withdrawing groups have also been shown to shift dyes to longer wavelengths. They do that by a push-pull effect that might also have effects on things like quantum yield and reversion rates by weakening the nitrogen-nitrogen bond. So looking at electron withdrawing groups is also interesting, and we can come up with at least 120 more possibilities. And so I've got some students who started looking into that. Longer term, it turns out the nitrile is not important for the dye. It actually hurts the dye. It makes it absorb at shorter wavelengths than it would otherwise, but we need it for synthetically. It has to be there on the step that forms this compound. But then maybe we can get rid of it. And so if we get to it, that's a kind of a ambitious aim to maybe get to, can we get rid of that nitrile and replace it with something else? Okay, we're talking about, right, at least 400 dyes so far. We need to winnow the field down a little bit. Not that we haven't already started using good, you know, organic chemical intuition, but we can also use TDDFT and DFT geometries and TDDFT excited state calculations to figure out what dyes we might most want to study. And so we've kind of got what's become a really major piece of the project is realizing that some of what Hughes and Abrahamian had published was great for their parent dye, and interestingly, they never looked at it for any of the other ones, and it's not so great for them. And so we're having to do a lot of computational method development to find ways to accomplish the same. We're funded by Committee 1, but we will still do a little bit of physical organic things like measure some quantum yields or at least reversion rates and extent of conversions for the dyes. And if along the way we can learn something about what synthetic handles may be viable, that's great. But I'll wrap up with that advice on getting PRF funding. And so the stuff in gray up top is stuff I've already said. But I'll add to it more from my reviewer hat. It just has to be a good proposal. It needs to be well written and well edited. You need to get outside eyes on it who can be honest with you and rip it to shreds and put more red ink on it than your PhD advisor did back in the day. You need to keep it hypothesis driven. It seems challenging, but it is doable even for exploratory or empirical projects. NSF might have either coined or at least touted the phrase broader impact, but I think it matters to every funding agency. You need to say how this fundamental science will impact the field, and you need to talk about human impacts. And there, I think PUIs really do have a leg up on that side of broader impacts. Scientifically, you need to identify likely stumbling blocks or bottlenecks and propose workarounds for the most troublesome ones. Your aims can't be so mutually interdependent that if one thing fails, you tank the entire project. Back to writing, you need to be readable and understandable to those not in your immediate area. But to help the reviewers be more in your immediate area, suggest good reviewers. And then some reviewers like me will actually use the reviewer list you provide as something of a review criterion. Do you know the field well enough? You know, yes, it's a new direction, but do you know the field well enough to propose some good reviewers? And I would suggest getting reviewers from both the PUI and R1 communities. The rest of the front matter matters too. Reviewers look at the safety, they look at where you get to tout your prior accomplishments, and we certainly look at how it's a new direction. And then finally, I'll conclude with what I started with on the advice, which is the program managers are a very valuable resource, and you should have iterative conversations with them. And with that, I will pass the baton to Sarah.
All right, we should have my screen here. So I'm Sarah Tasker. I am an assistant professor, and I just finished my second year at Franklin and Marshall College, which is a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And just a little bit, I guess, with Jason's criteria, I'm a maker, organic chemist, not a measurer. And I did PhD work in organometallic chemistry and a postdoc in medicinal chemistry, some like chemical biology screening, etc. And I actually, there we go. In January of 2018, I accepted a position at Franklin and Marshall, which is a liberal arts college in Lancaster with a really strong research tradition as well. And actually, while I was still a postdoc in March of that year, I applied for the PRF Undergraduate New Investigator Award. Started at FNM again 2 years ago this month. And then in that fall, actually got news that the grant was funded without any preliminary results on my first try. So 1 for 1. And shockingly. And in May, last summer, my funding started. It supported 1.5 students during the summer research period. I also have served as an ad hoc reviewer for PRF 3 times, so I've seen a little bit of the reviewer side of things. And so I think, you know, the fundamental place that you start with a grant is really that primary idea and fleshing it out into an actual proposal, from that spark to a proposal. And this is something, you know, speaking especially to somebody who's just getting their research career started as an independent researcher. I am doing something very, very different from either my PhD or postdoc work. And something that I was always sort of weirdly interested in was small strained ring systems like oxetanes here, which is a cyclobutane with an oxygen or an epoxide with an extra carbon. And they're really relevant for a lot of reasons in heterocycle synthesis and polymer and materials chemistry, and they're present in bioactive scaffolds, both natural and unnatural. And what drew me to them is I just find them really cool, which is a good first start, but also making them can be quite a challenge. If you go about it sort of in this traditional stepwise way, you can make them, but they tend to be really lengthy synthetic sequences. And the Paterno-Bucchi reaction, which is a photo 2+2 cycloaddition, is a much more attractive way to form them. So you're forming the CO and CC bonds in the same step, but there's a real impediment to that, or a limitation is the need for radical stabilizing groups, which then are of course present in your final product, which is great if that's what you want. But in a lot of cases, we're interested in oxetanes with different substitution patterns, and making it easier to access those is really important in a lot of ways, or at least I envisioned that. And so eventually, through a lot of reading and thinking and proposing and doodling, came up with this core idea, which was that we might be able to access these 2,3-disubstituted oxetanes, so the result of sort of formaldehyde 2+2 addition, in an indirect way by including using these S-aryl thioformates as transient radical stabilizing groups to do the 2+2 and then remove them. So I thought that was sort of clever and interesting and possible in all of those ways. But of course, I was going into that with no specific preliminary results or background in that field. But again, what's great about the Undergraduate New Investigator Award is that's not apparently necessary. So that's really great. So I propose sort of this is the core of my specific aim. One is this methodology development. And again, since I didn't have preliminary results, it was really important to me that at least we could make these kind of weird looking S-aryl thioformates, which have been previously synthesized for cross-coupling chemistry. So I thought that was at least something to point to. And then to explore that methodology, in specific aim 2, I proposed a bunch of mechanistic investigation. I proposed either direct irradiation or photoredox chemistry as potential routes, and that opens up a huge array of interesting mechanistic questions. And then in specific aim 3, exploration of the scope, what functional groups are tolerated, what different kinds of molecules can we build. And I think, you know, I just want to reflect on some takeaways or some advice for you in thinking about that initial idea and outline, especially if you're sort of a young, new faculty member, is you really want to think about that scope question very carefully. It needs to be really interesting and important and fun for you and interesting to students and reviewers and publishers, but you do not want to be in direct competition or race with R1 labs, with the armies of postdocs and grad students, because that's just not the reality that we're dealing with. Again, this has come up a couple of times, but new directions, make sure that your proposal really represents a new direction and that you explain that novelty explicitly and clearly. Don't feel like you should hide it or dance around it. That's something I really look at in terms of that reviewer hat on, I guess, but really thinking about that. And again, just basic grant writing here, be really clear about background and current context, explain how your work is grounded in the field, use appropriate references and figures without a laundry list of everything that's ever happened, and be really clear about what's different about your proposed work. And then be really thoughtful about practicalities. Again, as we've heard from our other panelists, there are both advantages and limitations to working at a PUI. So how can you be really strategic about the resources that you have access to or can get access to? I'm with Liz that I think it's better, ideal to have the ability to do everything within your lab, although certainly roles of collaborators are great as well. Explain really clearly how the work is feasible and will be carried out by undergrads, but you don't need to apologize or overly justify, but you just need to have really, really thought that out. I think when you're starting out, the best advice that I got was to really think and imagine yourself on day one showing up. How are you going to recruit students? What experiments are you going to do first? And I think that really comes across in the grant writing. And then the independence of specific aims, they should build on each other in that they're a coherent story, but try to avoid complete collapse if something goes wrong. And I would argue that mine are not ideal on that front. But again, that worked out okay for me. And then in that, be really honest about potential issues, both for yourself and for the reviewers. And again, you don't need to provide a backup for every single tiny little step, but think about those key issues that might happen or things that one could predict and think about how you're going to work around that. Again, with the writing, you want to give yourself time and have other people read it. I had my future chair read it. That was fantastic. I had people in my postdoc read it. I had an example of a PRF grant from one of my colleagues at Franklin and Marshall. And again, getting those eyes on it is incredibly important. Again, think about your reviewer. You need to logically and clearly explain everything. Every sentence should be clear. All your figures are really important that they clearly represent. I should be able to get a sense of your proposal just looking at the figures. And again, make sure that you really talk about the aspects beyond the actual scientific idea. How are you going to disseminate your work? What safety, practical considerations, recruitment, etc. Are you doing? And because of that, really don't neglect those supporting statements. Really flesh out all of the parts of the grant, not just the proposal itself. And again, talk to the program officers. Do as I say, not as I did on this one. I actually contacted Nancy like a few days before it was due to ask about panel, which panel I should submit to, and she thankfully read it over and was like, hey, your whole section in your specific aim 3 where you talk about applying your research or using natural products to test the scope is completely inappropriate for the petroleum relevance of this grant. And so I actually, again, fortunately, I was able to rewrite it at the last minute, but I could have been saved a lot of stress at the end if I had talked to the program officers earlier. And then find out and take advantage of all the resources your school has. So this will vary a lot between different PUIs. We actually did have a tiny grants office that was really helpful for me in getting a temporary appointment. So I had an F&M email address, collecting some signatures, working out the budgeting. But that could be successful grant writing peers, deans, etc. Whoever is your go-to person at your school. And again, even if that proposal doesn't get funded, it's extremely useful to organize plans, etc. And I just want to briefly mention how it's gone since then. So fortunately, the literature procedure did actually work. We were able to make and store these reagents in undergraduate hands, which was fantastic. We did a lot of screening. I just want to point out that things always go in directions that you don't anticipate. So we made and discovered this strange sulfoxide product due to radical decomposition, air oxidation, etc. And actually, we, at the beginning of March, discovered that some of our reactions under very specific conditions were yielding something that co-eluted on the GC, at least with an authentic sample of the free reduced oxetane. And so I just wanted to bring that up. Again, it's very unclear, because I know, especially for young faculty members, that the pandemic has been a really challenging time as we're trying to get our research started. So I just wanted to say you're not alone in that. Again, I think people's experiences have been different. Here in Southeastern Pennsylvania, I have not been able to enter my lab since March 13th, and we still do not have access. Our all summer research program was canceled. So again, I was supposed to have 4 students working on stuff this summer, and that just was completely impossible, although we may be getting back in our labs next week, maybe. So again, just to point out that this is really challenging, and I just wanted to mention that, because I think that really helps. So I did want to acknowledge the students that did this work. So Janice and Olivia, who are on the far left and far right of the group shot, did all of the work related to this project. I do have some other projects in my lab. But again, the PRF UNI funding was incredibly important in getting me started and believing in my research even before I arrived on campus. And so I'm really thankful for this opportunity, and I'm excited to hear all of your questions.
I would like to thank all the panelists for these great presentations and tips. And before we open the floor for questions, I would like to turn the time to Dr. Nancy Jensen, who leads the ACS Office of Research Grants. Nancy, would you like to say some words?
I would. Thank you very much. I apologize for not being on earlier. It was due to technical difficulties and not me failing to unmute. My computer was not picking up the sound properly. I couldn't hear you either. At any rate, my apologies for that, but I want to thank everybody that's joined us today. We appreciate that and hope you enjoyed and got a lot out of this webinar. In planning this webinar, I had thought about a couple of things, one of which is, and you've seen this brought up several times in the slide that ran in the beginning, as well as in a couple of the talks, that this is the 65th anniversary of PRF giving grants. And so this is part of our celebration, is having these webinars. But the bigger part is 2 of our 4 kinds of grants are specifically earmarked for undergraduate institutions, or primarily undergraduate institutions. And what we would like to see is more participation. And so our thoughts in this was, in April, we had I gave a webinar from the program officer's perspective, but we felt like if we could have some successful PUI submitters give talks, that this would be both inspirational as well as giving some good points. Now, I don't know about you, but I think they did a fantastic job at this, and I really, really appreciate the efforts of Sarah, Jason, Amy, and Liz. I think they accomplished that goal very well, and I hope those of you in the audience were able to take a lot away from this, because I think it was a very, very useful session. And I would be remiss, before I give up my microphone here, to thank those my co-sponsors here, Lindsay from Kerr. We appreciate that. We have some common interests, and I appreciate the collaboration that we've been able to forge, and hope that keeps going. And my friends in the education division at ACS, what would I do without you? Natalia, you did a wonderful job with the moderating, and Chris, who we haven't seen, is behind the scenes, and not only did he rescue me in my technical difficulties, but he's the one that does all this technical thing. So thank you all very much, audience, presenters, and the staff that helped. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I would like to remind everyone that you can use the question panel to enter your questions. We have been getting some questions throughout the webinar, so we will start with those. But please feel free to add any questions, and we can stay a little bit longer if needed. So feel free to continue to add your questions there. So to start with, I would like to ask the panelists a couple of questions related to when is the best stage in your career to apply for and/or receive a PRF grant? You all have talked about the different times in your careers where you applied or received the grants, and there were several incoming questions related to that. Do you have any suggestions for the attendees?
So I would say that really any time, and that's one of the beauties of PRF is that they're really wide open to folks at a wide range of career stages. The UNI program is limited to 3 tries in your pre-tenure period. But people get them right on their very first try, even before they come to campus. Sarah did, but so did Chris Turlington at Hope and other folks that I know. So that's a fine time. Or once you have a little bit of preliminary results is fine too. Or when you're a senior faculty member, change in directions. Really, there are opportunities kind of all along the way, and so I would encourage you to do it as soon as you feel ready, or maybe even before you really feel ready, but as soon as you feel like you can carve out enough time to do it.
Yeah, I would say for sure, just do it, go for it. Especially, you know, as a incoming person who had barely even hypothetically gotten a job, I was a little bit like, I guess this is a thing, I guess I'll do it. And it was extremely, just the process of grant writing is so helpful. And again, you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And especially for people in that new faculty position, yeah, get all of your shots at the UNI. I think that's a really, really special grant. It's been really amazing.
I would agree. I'm sorry. I just want to say I agree, and I find the grant writing process itself very helpful. I learned so much every time I write a grant, even if it's not successful. And so taking the time to step back, reflect on where I want to go, assess the literature is extremely valuable, even if it's not funded the first time.
Thank you, Liz. Amy, did you want to add anything? Okay,
Great.
perfect.
I do want to throw one
so
more thought out there real quick, Natalia, if I can. And this is a close to 20-year-old data point now. The one time I had heard not to apply to PRF was I had gotten the Dreyfus Startup Award, which no longer exists. And at the time, that was kind of as much an award for accomplishments to date and promise as it was for anything you were really proposing to do. And so it felt more like an award and not like a grant. And so I had asked PRF if it was still okay to submit a UNI at that time. And they said, no, since you've got some money to do that work already, don't also apply to UNI. And so I guess if you're coming in with like a K99 NIH grant or something where you've already got external money, I'd talk to a program officer before you apply to UNI.
Thank you, Jason. And you also mentioned talking to program officers, which is related to some of the questions that we received. I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on the different panels and what were your suggestions or tips, apart from talking to program officers, into deciding which panel would be more applicable for your specific field or grant idea.
Yeah, I think you can just ask. So the reason that I got in touch with the program officers way too late was that I had that exact question. I was like, I don't know, am I a panel 1 or panel 4? And I just like ask that question. I think that's the best way to do that.
And if you Google ACS PRF panels, the very first hit that comes up is a PDF file that describes the 10 panels for you. And then if you Google ACS PRF program managers, you get who's responsible for which panels. And so, like, for instance, Nancy's in charge of synthetic organic chemistry, which is panel 1, but also inorganic chemistry, which is panel 3. So if you're kind of a catalysis person, she could easily help you differentiate between those two. Or like Sarah and I talked about, are we physical organic under ASCAR, or are we synthetic organic under Nancy? And so you can see the whole list of 10 of them, and that they also have a nice list of things that are excluded and that PRF doesn't fund. And so I think the right thing to do is just Google that and do a little reading and then talk to program officers.
Okay.
Yeah, and then just mechanically, this is always something that comes up, is like, how do you contact a program officer? You could just send an email, ideally with like a white paper or a draft or something with it potentially. And potentially set up a phone call or something like that. But I made my first contact via email.
Great. So the other question was related to something that also came up, and it's what it means to support fundamental research in the petroleum field. can you provide a little bit more of, or maybe more details on how you interpreted that and how you tailor your grant, or explain the relationship to the petroleum field?
So I can talk about my research. I think as a polymer chemist, it was both easy for me to pick like which panel I submitted it to, right? The polymer chemistry one. And then the ties to petroleum are clear both from like a feedstock point of view, but then the proposal that I submitted talked about potential applications, right? So we're still learning fundamentals about how the polymer structure affects those stimuli responsive properties, but the potential applications included like enhanced oil recovery to be able to capture more oil from oil wells, and so that was an the direct application towards petroleum.
And I can draw some parallels from my research too. It became very clear early on talking to Askar and Nancy that photo switching was a word that PRF did not want to hear in a proposal. It felt too applied to them. Photomechanical materials was also felt a little applied to them. Whereas kind of the physical organic chemistry of the dyes and even the isomerization of the dyes, I just can't call it photo switching, was fine for panel 4, but they didn't think that I was particularly petroleum relevant, whereas the synthetic panel said, no, you're taking really cheap coal tar feedstocks and turning it into high value dyes. That's petroleum relevant enough for us. But keeping it fundamental there. They didn't really want to hear about tailoring dyes. They wanted it just to be, oh, this big scope of dyes. And again, you kind of keep it fundamental that way. But again, those are all kind of things that I know we sound like a broken record, but talk to the program officers.
Well, that seems to be a very important take-home message, so it's good to reiterate, I guess. Moving to some of the other questions that were related to COVID and the current situation. One of them, relates to the fact that basically if it's okay or it's recommended to disclose something related to not being able to go back to the lab or do the research to the full extent, would you say that that's a recommendation that you would advise on adding something related to basically addressing the issues that might come up?
I mean, there's a long lead time with applying to a grant, right? Like, when you apply and when you get funding is, quite far away, potentially almost a year. And so, again, I think there's a lot of disruption now. I'm not sure any of us can like predict in 10 months what the disruption might be. So I might not include that information, but I don't know if that's official guidance.
For myself, I don't have active PRF funding, but my other funding agencies have all reached out and said, this is an extremely unusual situation where we can be understanding, let us know if you need no cost extensions. And we're all in the same boat here. And so I think we're all just trying to make it work as best we can.
Yeah, and I think I'm sorry, Amy, go for it.
No, you go.
Amy, then Sarah?
I was just gonna say really quick, I think, yeah, if you have active funding, I mean, right when it realized this shutdown thing was happening, I did contact Nancy and was like, hey, this is what's happening, like no cost. So I'm already planning again to take that no cost extension based on the year. This is just a scratch year, this summer at least.
I would also say that if your college has an office of sponsored programs or whatever the name is, I mean, these folks they reached out to all of the researchers with current funding, and they're trying to really be a resource to cobble together what information has come from the funding agencies and what the funding agencies like. So again, I also don't have PRF active funding right now. I have a different agency, NSF, and I've not reached out directly to that PO because we're working through the Office of Sponsored Programs, and indeed they put out a preliminary call to us. We responded, but now it's a few weeks later. Things seem to change every week in our country and in our lab, and I reached back to them and said, we need to amend what we told you a few weeks ago, and they're very open. So I would hope we could count on our colleges to intercede for us and to make things clear. Things are massively unclear now.
Yeah, I would concur with the advice, though, to write the proposal to do the science you want to do in the hopes that we're going to be back to normal, probably about the time that anything that you're submitting in the next couple of rounds are going to be funded. And I believe that PRF has kind of already made a blanket statement of an automatic 1-year no cost for anybody with an active PRF grant right now. And that's kind of on top of the fact that it's not very hard to get a no cost extension from PRF anyway. And so I think it was Amy that showed 2 grants that both had 1 or 2 years of no cost extensions on them. And I think that kind of most of us in the community sort of assume that, yeah, it's a 3-year grant, but you know, if I've got a little other internal money and stuff, I can probably stretch it to 4, no problem. COVID's going to make it that a lot of us are stretching them to 5, perhaps, and I think that's totally fine.
Yes, and I want to confirm that PRF is liberally given no cost extensions at the time, so for the participants to know. So I think we will go to the last question and then maybe doing final thoughts from the panelists. So the last question is, for someone whose research background is not necessarily related to petroleum research, but they're interested in pursuing interdisciplinary research relevant to the ACS PRF topics. They're wondering if you have any tips or advice for a situation like that. And I think some of you talked about transitioning into a different field that you might not have as much experience. So comments?
Well, I can just say that I feel that my research, listening to all the wonderful talks of my co-panelists, mine is definitely the least petroleum relevant. So please don't retroactively take my funding away, ACS. But you know, really, the hook on which I hung my first project was it being relevant to zeolites and microporous material, which are very important for oil exploration. But there was nothing oily that I suggested putting in any material. It was really about structural assays done on the computer. And the soft matter work now is even more tenuously related to petroleum industry things. But materials research is very important to the PRF, I know. And so I feel quite lucky that I was funded for the second project. And I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but there, in the spirit of, you know, maybe Sarah said it, you know, shoot for the goal, you miss 100% of those that you don't try. And in the spirit of what others said, you know, Jason and Elizabeth, you know, talk back and forth a lot and say, is this relevant? Is there a way I can make it more relevant? You don't want to torque your research into something that you would not want to do. That's a bridge too far. Research is too important, and it calls forth a lot from you and your students. But yeah, mine feels quite remote to petroleum to me. I don't know.
I think anytime you're, entering a field that you're a little bit less obviously trained in, I think, what you need to do is to make the case that you do understand the state of the field, that you need to then be extra careful that your background is comprehensive and thoughtful and analytical about the state of the field. So in that scenario, I would, again, really focus on showing your credentials like through the thoughtful analysis and accurate state of the field and what you're adding to it, and maybe even how you can bring perhaps a perspective from a slightly different area into and benefit the field as a whole. So just on that front.
I also think that I echo everything that's been said, but I would add, looking at proposals is a great way to know how people do it. And so there's 2 ways to do that. One, I have made a career of being absolutely shameless at looking at lists of funded proposals from places and then pinging those folks and saying, wow, would you be willing to share your proposal? And folks have been remarkably generous I can say that for the last 17 years, folks have been remarkably generous at sharing funded proposals. But the one that Nancy will like to hear even more is another great way to see a lot of proposals is to agree to a review for a funding agency. And so if you review PRF proposals, you'll get to see how do other people make the case that synthetic organic chemistry is portfolio relevant, or polymer science, or geology, or material science, or whatever. Really, you can tie a lot of things back, and sometimes you can get the seed of an idea by looking at somebody else's proposal that does a great job, or even one that sometimes they did a less good job. You can think about, oh, I could do this better, and either of those can be helpful.
Thank you so much. And I would like to give you time to share maybe one last thought with the participants. Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, sorry, just unmuting myself. Yeah, I think go for it. Like, again, try. I don't want to gloss over how much work it is to put together a really thoughtful proposal, because it is, it is sort of a zero-sum game with all of our other responsibilities. But I think it's really important to carve out time to do that. And again, just give yourself time. Start with a great idea, move on to great writing, and make sure it's something that you're really passionate about, that you really want to do. Because again, hopefully the funding is just the first step, and then you get to actually go and do the stuff and do the exploration.
Thank you, Sarah. Jason?
I think I said most of my things because I've talked a lot, but I guess the one thing I haven't said that I'll add is the idea of being receptive to critical feedback. When the program officer tells you something that you don't want to hear, when Asker says, no, that's not fundamental enough, or Nancy says, oh no, don't say photo switch. You've got to be able to take that and roll with it and use it to make it better. Same thing when you get negative reviews, right? We've heard about people taking multiple tries to get these. Reviewer feedback is pure gold, and that's another reason to get out there and apply early. Maybe you still have startup, maybe you don't need the grant so bad yet, and it's easy to back burner it, but getting that feedback is so crucial.
Thank you, Jason. Liz?
Yeah, so I've spent quite some time over the years thinking about how I fit in both into the research projects that I've been focusing on, but also what am I contributing beyond just the new cutting edge research that we're doing, right? How am I helping students? How am I helping them be successful in the next step and training them? And so seeing how I fit into the bigger research endeavor, within the country and worldwide, like it's made me happier and I think more successful as well.
Thank you, Liz. Amy?
Wow. Well, I suppose my comments would be along the line of Petroleum Research Fund has done so many things for my research program, and I'd like to jump onto what Elizabeth said. It would be wonderful to not only keep this momentum in terms of how Petroleum Research Fund does what it already does superbly well, but to have some more conversations about how it can even further enhance the experiences of our students on our campuses and the well-being of our research efforts and the longevity. One thing that often happens is we have these labs that we establish, and our students flourish in them, and I'm blown away by the 50-some students that Elizabeth has had come and find a home in her lab. It's incredible. And okay, so it seems a little critical, but I'll put it out there. It's not criticism of PRF, it's criticism of every granting agency. One category that just doesn't seem to get funded is sabbatical funding for a faculty member to stay home in their lab. We can be funded to go away. We can be funded for the summer. We can't be funded for a sabbatical in our lab because that sounds like buying oneself out of teaching. Yet our wonderful PUIs give us sabbaticals, and they want to support us, but they don't always have the money. And we often want to take the sabbaticals, but sometimes we just can't afford it. We're raising families, we're doing whatever. It would be amazing if, based on some dialogue, an organization stepped forward and said, we will actually fund you to stay home in your lab for a sabbatical that is granted by your institution. And I just think that might be the next step toward building a super strong research effort that would support our students for the long term. So just a tiny little novel thought, and thank you for receiving it.
Well, with that, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists and for sharing your experiences and advice. I would like to thank Lindsay Curry, and Kerr, and Dr. Nathan Jensen, and all of you, the panelists, attendees. And with that, I would like to close the webinar. Good